There are moments in history that don't just change the economy, they change how people think, how families survive, and how an entire generation sees the world. The Great Depression was one of those moments. It didn't arrive with a single dramatic event. It crept in quietly. A stock market crash here, a factory closing there, until suddenly millions of Americans realized the life they thought was secure had vanished almost overnight. Bank accounts were wiped out. Jobs disappeared. Pride was swallowed. And for the first time, many Americans learned what real hunger felt like. This wasn't just a financial crisis, it was a daily fight to endure. Today, we're going to step inside that world. Not the headlines or the statistics, but the lived experience. What it actually felt like to wake up each morning during the Great Depression in America. To understand daily life during the Great Depression, you have to understand how quickly everything collapsed. In October 1929, the stock market crashed. At first, many Americans believed it was temporary. The Roaring '20s had been a decade of confidence, of consumer spending, and of easy credit. People had grown used to the idea that prosperity was permanent. But within months, factories slowed production and businesses cut hours. Then they started laying people off entirely. By 1933, nearly 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. For those who still had jobs, wages were slashed. A man who had supported a family comfortably just a year earlier might now be earning half his previous pay, if he was lucky enough to still be working at all. For millions, unemployment wasn't an abstract number. It was the center of daily life. Men would wake up early, put on their best suit, and walk miles across cities looking for work. They lined up outside factories before dawn, hoping to be chosen for a day's labor. Often, the foreman would pick only a handful of men. The rest walked home in silence. Pride kept many from telling their families how desperate things had become. Some men left home altogether, becoming drifters who rode freight trains across the country in search of work. They were called hobos, and the rail yards filled with them. Riding the rails was dangerous and illegal, but hunger left little room for fear. Inside American homes, life changed dramatically. Houses grew colder in winter because families could not afford coal or heating oil. People sealed off rooms to conserve heat, living together in 1 or 2 spaces. Electricity, if still connected, was used sparingly. Lights were turned off whenever possible. Water usage was carefully watched. Every penny mattered. Furniture was sold. Radios were pawned. Wedding rings sometimes disappeared into pawn shops, exchanged for a few dollars to buy food. Food became the central concern of everyday life. Meals were simple and repetitive. Bread, beans, potatoes, and soup formed the backbone of the American diet. Meat was rare. Fresh fruit was a luxury. Families stretched food in creative ways, watering down milk, adding flour to soups, and saving bacon grease to flavor meals. Children learned not to ask for seconds. Parents often went hungry so their kids could eat. Hunger was a constant dull ache that people learned to live with. Malnutrition became common, especially among children and the elderly. For those with no income at all, survival depended on charity. Bread lines appeared in every major city. Long lines of men, hats pulled low, waiting quietly for a bowl of soup or a piece of bread. Soup kitchens were run by churches, charities, and sometimes local governments. There was no shame-free way to stand in those lines. Even though millions were doing it, each person felt the weight of humiliation. Some Americans skipped the lines entirely and scavenged for food, searching trash bins behind restaurants or grocery stores. Housing insecurity was another daily reality. Families who couldn't pay rent were evicted. entire neighborhoods of makeshift shelters sprang up on the edges of cities. These shanty towns were sarcastically called Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the crisis. Homes were built from scrap wood, cardboard, tin, and anything else people could find. There was no running water, no electricity, and little sanitation. Fires were common. Disease spread easily. Yet for many, these shacks were better than sleeping on the streets. Rural America faced its own version of the Great Depression, and in many ways, it was even harsher. Farmers had already been struggling before the crash because crop prices were so low. When the Depression hit, life in many rural communities collapsed completely. Crops were worth so little that farmers sometimes let them rot because selling them would not even cover transportation costs. At the same time, drought struck the Great Plains, creating the Dust Bowl. Topsoil blew away in massive black clouds that turned day into night. Farms failed, and families lost land that had been in their families for generations. Thousands packed what little they owned into old cars and headed west, hoping California would offer work. Many found only disappointment, hostility, and poverty. Children growing up during the Great Depression experienced a childhood shaped by scarcity. Toys were homemade. Games were invented with whatever materials were available. School attendance dropped as children were expected to help support their families. Some took part-time jobs, others quit school entirely. Shoes were worn until they fell apart. Clothes were patched again and again. Yet many who grew up in this era later recalled strong family bonds. Families spent evenings together because entertainment cost nothing. Radios were treasured. Listening to programs together was a shared ritual that brought temporary escape from worry. Despite the suffering, Americans looked for hope wherever they could find it. Movies were a popular escape. For a few cents, people could sit in a warm theater and forget their troubles for a couple of hours. Hollywood responded with musicals, comedies, and glamorous films that showed a world far removed from breadlines and unemployment. Radio also played a major role. Programs like comedy shows, dramas, and live music brought voices into living rooms across the nation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt used radio in a powerful way through his famous fireside chats. Speaking calmly and directly to the American people, he explained policies and reassured citizens that the government was taking action. When Roosevelt took office in 1933, he launched what became known as the New Deal. It was not a single program, but a collection of initiatives designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. Government work programs put millions of Americans back to work building roads, bridges, schools, and parks. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men to work in forests and national parks. The Works Progress Administration hired artists, writers, musicians, and laborers alike. For many families, these jobs meant the difference between starvation and survival. The pay was not high, but it was steady. And just as important, it restored a sense of dignity. Banks were another source of fear during the Depression. When banks failed, people lost their savings instantly. There was no insurance. Entire life savings vanished overnight. This led to bank runs, where crowds rushed to withdraw money, often causing banks to collapse even faster. People learned to distrust financial institutions. Cash was hidden in mattresses, jars, and walls. The New Deal introduced reforms like bank insurance to restore confidence, but the memory of loss lingered for decades. Social life changed dramatically during this era. Extravagance was frowned upon. Even those who still had money avoided showing it. Communities became tighter out of necessity. Neighbors helped neighbors. People shared food, watched each other's children, and traded services instead of money. A man might fix a neighbor's roof in exchange for a sack of potatoes. These informal networks kept many families afloat when official systems failed. Emotionally, the Great Depression left deep scars. Anxiety and depression were widespread, though rarely discussed openly. Suicide rates increased. Men who had defined themselves by their ability to provide felt worthless when they could not find work. Women took on enormous emotional labor, keeping families together under relentless stress. Yet there was also resilience. Humor survived. Music reflected both sorrow and hope, with blues and folk songs capturing the hardship of the era. By the late 1930s, the worst of the Depression had eased, but life never returned to the carefree optimism of the 1920s. Americans had been changed. They learned to save. They distrusted debt. They valued stability over risk. Even after World War II brought full employment and prosperity, the habits formed during the Depression remained. People who lived through it never forgot what hunger felt like. They never forgot how fragile security could be. What life was like during the Great Depression in America was not just about poverty, it was about adaptation. It was about families learning to survive with almost nothing. It was about dignity tested daily. It was about fear, yes, but also about endurance. The people who lived through it did not see themselves as heroic. They simply did what they had to do to get through another day. And in doing so, they reshaped American values for generations to come.